So, Dr. Paul, let's go ahead and do the personal injury documentation remedial training. What this is just a real simple way of going into personal injury. I'm going to go step by step into each of these categories and go, okay, this is how personal injury works. And it all starts with documentation. And I say personal injury is like a 1-2 punch. You need to know the documentation and you need to know the marketing. And the reason for that, let's say you know the marketing. Let's say you know how to get attorneys to refer, but then you give them crappy documentation. Well, you're going to get fired anyway. Let's say you know the documentation, but you don't know the marketing. Well, great. You got the documentation, but now you don't know how to get the referrals. So it's really a 1-2 punch. It's marketing with its documentation combined with the marketing. And what's so interesting and why it's such a huge opportunity. I mean, I routinely have doctors increase their practice $200,000, $500,000, $1 million. That's kind of normal for my clients. And the reason why is this, is after you know the documentation, there's a huge potential market. Now, there's really good news and bad news about that. So how big is the market? Well, 2% of people are in auto accidents every year. So you can take your geographic radius of draw, multiply it times 2%. That's how many people are in auto accidents every year. But out of those accidents, 87% of them are a soft tissue injury. Only 32% are disc, 16% are nerve, 10% are mild concussion, and 2% are fractures. Now, why is that important? It's important because the chiropractor cannot compete against a medical doctor just on profession alone. So a chiropractor is not, just on surface face value, is not going to beat out the neurosurgeon, the orthopedic surgeon, their neurologist. So the great news is you don't have to worry about competing against the other providers who naturally have way more authority than the chiropractor because the vast minority of the injuries are medical. So the soft tissue injury is 87%. That's the vast majority of the injuries. Well, there's nobody in that category. There's nobody. Now, chiropractic's not in that category also, unfortunately. But the good news is there's no authoritative competition with medical in that category. Now, you get to a disc injury, that's a different story. A neurosurgeon, orthopedic surgeon will always beat out the chiropractor for the referral from a professional standpoint. Now, that's not true if you establish the relationship. In other words, you personally sold the attorney. In other words, he believes in you, not chiropractic. So that's different. I'm talking about the industry. So 32% are disc. Okay, so we don't even compete with those. We don't even try to. I'm not going to try to go up against an orthopedic surgeon, neurosurgeon. And same with nerve injuries are 16%. I'm not going to try to go up against a neurologist or a neurosurgeon. And same with a mild concussion. There's no way I'm going to try to go up against an orthopedic surgeon, especially a neurosurgeon or a neurologist. You know, that just doesn't cut it. You know, that's the state of chiropractic, unfortunately, because there's only 8% utilization with a 67% negative name recognition. So we can't compete. We don't have the authority. We don't have the trust. We don't have the credibility. But there's one segment of the market that's huge, that's wide open. That's the soft tissue injury. That's the majority of the cases. So I don't even want to fool. I don't even want to put my foot in the water trying to compete against the orthopedic surgeon, neurosurgeon, et cetera. And I cover this in great detail when we go into marketing. But the point is, there's a huge opportunity of these low-impact soft tissue spinal injuries. Now, when we say low-impact soft tissue spinal injuries, we're talking about under 20 miles an hour. That's what we're talking about. And that's what we get as chiropractors. 80% of all car injuries are under 20 miles an hour. And 87% of them have a soft tissue injury. That's a big market. That's way big. And we got no competition. There's an orthopedic surgeon can't compete against me with a soft tissue injury. A neurosurgeon can't compete against me with a soft tissue, just like I'm not going to be able to compete against them with authority and credibility in the attorney's eyes. So that's the opportunity that exists. That's the good news. The bad news is it takes a certain type of marketing to get those referrals. And so when we look at marketing, you go, there's publicity, advertising, and educational sales. Publicity and advertising doesn't work because they're not looking to refer to a chiropractor. This is why chiropractors, talk to attorneys all the time and never get any referrals. The only marketing that does work is a marketing that shifts their consciousness from unconscious, incompetent to conscious incompetent. So right now, you have all these attorneys that have absolutely no desire for chiropractic. And it's the same reason that 92% of the population doesn't go to a chiropractor. They're confused with all the mixed messaging and chiropractic saying it can do everything. So you got all these potential business, and you have these attorneys who don't use chiropractic, don't have a perceived need for chiropractic. And if they've experienced chiropractors, 95% with personal injury, 95% of the time, they've been given crap documentation. Now, how do you know that there's crap documentation? It gives less than a 3-to-1 injury award. In other words, the medicals give less than a 3-to-1 injury award. Well, how do you know that? Well, the first way to know you're giving crap documentation is the attorney's asking you to cut your bill. He has to ask you to cut your bill because the documentation is not good enough to get a 3-to-1 injury award versus the size of your bill. That's the big problem in chiropractic. And the chiropractors don't know any better. The attorney asks them to cut their bill. They get pissed at the attorney. The attorney doesn't know that up to 70% of the documentation was not even done by the chiropractor because the chiropractor doesn't know it. He doesn't even know what he's not doing. So he thinks it's okay. He sends this big whopper bill to the attorney that's crap, that gets less than a 2-to-1 injury award. The attorney has to ask them to cut their bill. And so the chiropractor's pissed, and the attorney's certainly not satisfied with what's going on. So they only need chiropractors. Unfortunately, they only need chiropractors for a medical bill. And that's why they just bypass chiropractors routinely when there's a disc injury or nerve injury. They got way more credible, authoritative sources. So what's the key? The key is knowing how to shift. The number one is knowing the documentation. But again, that doesn't matter because the vast majority of personal injury attorneys are not knocking down chiropractors' doors to refer to them because of what I just said. So you got this big market that's just sitting there. You go, well, how do you tap into that? You have to know what's called educational sales or sales. Sales is the process that shifts your target market's consciousness from unconscious incompetence, where they don't even know there's a problem, to now being aware there's a problem. That's what sales does. That's the only marketing that works. That's why advertising does not work, and that's why publicity does not work. But that's also why educational sales works unbelievably well when it's combined with good documentation. And that's exactly how we get chiropractors. My clients, 92% of my clients increase their business over $100,000 in 90 days, which is unbelievably easy to do. You get one attorney sending you 2 cases a month, or 2 attorneys sending you 1 or 2 cases a month. You just went over $100,000. And the average chiropractor I have client goes over $250,000, usually within 6 months to a year. $250,000. I mean, if you only had, again, it depends on your case average. But if you had 2 or 3 attorneys sending you 2 cases a month, 2, 4, 6, and your case average was say $4,000, 4 times 6 is $24,000. That's just under $300,000 a year from only 3 attorneys referring 2 cases a month. So this is why it's so easy. Well, I'm not going to say easy. It's not easy. That's why it's so, well, it's so easy to have a huge increase in income, not just $5,000 or $10,000. That's why. It's not easy. You do have to learn the documentation, and it's not, educational sales is not easy. If it was easy, everybody'd be doing it. So that's where the potential's at, is target the soft tissue injury, the low impact soft tissue injury, not the disc, and I go into this in marketing in great detail, not the nerve, not the mild concussion, because you can't compete, and it's the smallest percentage anyway. Go after the low impact soft tissue spinal injury. Nobody's in that category. And then when you use educational sales, you can totally shift the attorney's consciousness to where, and that's literally what happens, to where they didn't even think they needed you, to now they ask you to be their expert witness. And that routinely happens in about 50% of my clients' cases when they actually do what's called a forensic case analysis and show the attorney everything that's missing and how it's hurting and limiting the injury award. Okay, so that's the short version of the potential. And we'll obviously go way greater into that when we cover marketing. Now let's go into the documentation, because again, if you don't have the documentation, they're going to find out you're a fraud. You don't know what you're doing. So this is the documentation that will take an injury award 3 times or greater than the medicals. This is how it all comes together. So let's start with the big picture first. So let's go to some major concepts first. And I'm going to go right, let's see. Let's go with this one first right here. So this is a major concept. There are 7 minimum categories that determine the strength of a case. 7. Now there's all kinds of categories you can have, but there's 7 you better have. In other words, this is the guideline that I used when I spoke with my attorneys and I showed them how strong or how weak of a case they have. Now, they don't know this. They generally do know based on big principles. I always say attorneys kind of, remember, they're not medical providers. They haven't gone to medical school. They haven't gone to chiropractic college. They went to law school. So attorneys look at only 3 factors to determine if they have a good case. The amount of property damage that was done, if there was surgery, or if they had a positive MRI. In other words, big items like that. Well, that's not the low impact soft tissue spinal injury. So you won't have those. You won't have a positive MRI. You won't have large amount of property damage. You won't have it. Okay, and you won't have surgery. So having said that, these are the 7 minimum, okay? And what I would do, so we do have to know these, because you will be telling the attorney when you get all this documentation, you will be telling them how strong of a case they have. In other words, I was the one who told my attorneys how strong of a case they have, and this is how, and whether or not they should go to court or not, if they didn't get what they wanted. So if I did not have all these 7 categories, I told the attorney, I do not recommend going to court. I recommend just settling for much as you can and moving on. So here's the 7 minimum categories. Number 1, mechanism of injury. There's got to be a cause and effect relationship. Somebody's got to be liable. That has to be there, period. That's not maybe, kind of, sort of. Now remember, there's a lot of other categories that can be included that'll help the case, but that's not what we're talking about right now. We're talking about the bare minimum that creates a strong case. That's what we're talking about. Okay. Number 2, subjective evidence. Now, this is that MMI. maximum medical improvement. Because things change. When patients first come in, they could have a lot of positive findings as they get treated. Some of it or all of it can clear up. That's not what's important to the injury award. Now, remember, when I speak with you, I'm going to be talking to you from an injury award perspective, not as much of the clinical. Obviously, it's bad for the patient, but we're talking about attorney referrals. Okay, so we're kind of going to be looking from the injury award perspective. So it needs to be at MMI. Why MMI? Maximum medical improvement. Because it's permanent now. That's why. Now that gets to be real important when we go into the injury awards, which I'm going to be covering next. But in short, when the injury is permanent, that will increase the potential injury awards from 2 to 4, from 2 injury awards to 4 injury awards. That's what it does. Now, there's something we call primary evidence and secondary evidence. So we'll look at subjective findings, and obviously subjective is what the patient feels. Okay, that's not as trustworthy and not as reliable. Then we're going to go, well, how much primary subjective evidence do we have? Well, what are we going to call primary and what are we going to call secondary? Primary is it directly relates to the problem. In other words, if the person had a mechanism of injury to the neck and they got neck pain, that's primary. That's directly related to the neck and the injury. Secondary might be mid-back pain or foot pain or something like that relative to the neck. So foot pain would be secondary to the neck after an injury. It would be primary to the foot. So all you're doing is you're showing the attorney the relative importance of that document, that evidence. So that's what you just need to be aware. Because I'll give you another example. Well, I'll go as we go through. So then there's secondary. So hopefully you kind of got the idea of primary or secondary. Okay, so that's now you need at least one. There needs to be at least one subjective finding that's primary at MMI. Okay, that's the rule. Go to number 2, hybrid evidence. Hybrid evidence is a combination of the patient's actions or reactions and the doctor's response. How is the doctor interpreting that? Okay, that involves 2 people. Most evidence is hybrid that doctors think is objective, and we'll cover this. Now, it's important for you to know this, you to know the difference between subjective evidence, hybrid evidence, and objective evidence. Okay, that shows that you know what the heck's going on and the different degrees of trust, because let's face it, objective evidence is way more valuable than subjective evidence. It's indisputable. Subjective, they can just make it up on their own. Okay, so same with hybrid evidence. Do you have at least one primary piece of evidence directly related to that mechanism of injury? Okay. Now, obviously, it helps if you have more than one primary and you have secondary, right? That helps. And if they're in multiple categories, like let's say you have a muscle category positive, you have an orthopedic joint category positive, that's hybrid evidence. You have a range of motion category, that's hybrid. See, so that would be 3 separate categories, which is even better. So if we have multiple categories, that helps increase the strength. If you have primary and more than one primary in the same category or different category, that makes it stronger. And if you have secondary is obviously not as important, but it helps build the case. So, and then you go to the objective evidence. So you got objective evidence is obviously it's interpreted the same by the physicians. It's totally independent of the patient. It's the most trustworthy. So we got to pay a lot of attention to the objective evidence category. And we're going to say the same thing. Do we have primary evidence for the objective? See, when you talk like this, you're showing the attorney, you know what's going on. You know how this comes together. You know what's most important, least important. See? Shows you know something. All right, so objective evidence, obviously, if we have more than one primary objective evidence, that's better. It's better, it's good if you have more than one primary evidence. If it's in separate categories, that's good. See? And then obviously it's good if you had, you know, at least some secondary and multiple secondary, or if secondary was in multiple categories. So that's kind of how you have to think of hybrid, subjective, hybrid, and objective. And you kind of think of it like a pyramid. A personal injury case is like a pyramid. And I call it horizontal and vertical documentation. Horizontal, so this is kind of what we're covering. Horizontal is mechanism of injury, subjective, hybrid, objective. That's horizontal. Vertical is primary, secondary, or multiple categories of documentation. So that's why I call it horizontal and vertical documentation. And it all leads to one goal. What's the pinnacle of the pyramid? It's, does the person have a permanent impairment that's causing permanent restrictions in their activities of daily living the rest of their lives? That's the absolute pinnacle of the injury award, period. Everything else goes to support it. You're the one that's going to be showing the attorney this. So he knows, you know what's going, how this all comes together. They don't know what I just shared with you. They have rough ideas, but the details of what I just shared with you, they don't know. You have to be able to explain this to them, horizontal, vertical document, to show them what they do or do not have. Number 5 is maximum medical improvement. Now that's based on the science of the 3 phases of healing. So you do have to know that, because that's when you can give an impairment rating according to the AMA guides. So that becomes real important. In other words, do we definitely need MMI? Yes, that's not an option for a strong case. Okay. Now, once we get MMI, now we've got the impairment. Now we have an impairment. And remember, that's one of the 2 most important categories of the injury award. Was there a permanent? And by the way, impairment means permanent. Doesn't mean 90 days. So we go to the impairment rating. That's out of the AMA guides. That's third-party trust, okay? And what are called impairment indexes. Remember, this is the number 1 most important category. Was there a permanent impairment? And did it cause permanent pain and restrictions with activities of daily living? That's what impairment indexes are. They document pain and restrictions of activities of daily living. That's what an impairment index does, okay? You can't give an impairment index if there's no impairment. You can't give an impairment if there's no MMI. MMI is based on the science of the 3 phases of healing. See how this connects? And by the way, when you know this and you know how to explain it, this is why you never lose a case in court. And I say it all the time. One of the reasons I never lost a case in court is because I knew when not to go to court. I knew based on these categories. So if I did not have one of these categories documented, I told the attorney. And obviously some are more important than others. Like objective evidence, is that pretty important? Yeah. If I didn't have any objective evidence, I'm telling the attorney, do everything you can not to go to court. This is going to turn out bad. Did he have a permanent impairment? That's not, you know, again, if you do, that's good for the injury award, bad for the patient. And then you go to the prognosis and need for future care. Is that important? Yeah, that's real important. So these are the 7 minimum categories. 7.
Dr. Paul?
Yeah.
Are we going to cover or go over the subjective, hybrid, and objective more detail later?
Remember I said in the beginning, I'm going to do a big funnel, paint the big picture, and then we're going to go into great detail and just lead you down step by step to the end result.
Gotcha. Sorry.
We are big picture right now. We need you to wrap your head around how this works. If I do a great detail without you seeing the big picture, we get lost. Okay, so, all right. So that's the 7. There's definitely more. This is the 7 minimum. So as an example, I'll show you this. These are the 12 categories. These are the main 12 categories of documentation for a narrative report, deposition, or trial testimony. Right there. That's the 7 minimum, or 12. Now, are there more than 12 when I'm in a deposition or narrative? Yeah. But when we look at the big picture, what's the 12 that's the core of a narrative report, deposition, or trial testimony? Well, these are the 12, okay? You're going to recognize 7 of them. 7 of these 12 are imperative that will determine the strength of the case. Some of these aren't. So let's go through and play them out. So was mechanism of injury, was that imperative? Yes. Were injury magnifiers imperative to determine the strength of a case? No. No. That's why it was not included. Does it help the case? Yeah. And we cover what this is. We'll cover all of this. Then we go into subjective evidence at MMI. Do we need at least one primary subjective evidence at MMI for determining the strength of a case? Yes. Do we need at least one piece of evidence, hybrid evidence at MMI to determine the strength of a case? Yes. Do we need at least one objective piece of evidence primary? Yes. Okay. So you should recognize that. Now, in the narrative report, deposition or trial testimony, we'll go into the therapeutic protocol and how it was based on the patient's positive test relative to the science of the 3 phases of healing. Now, is that important? Is that one of the 7 major important categories that you definitely need to have that's going to determine the strength of a case? No. They couldn't have gotten any therapy at all, and you could still have a great, strong case. See? But is it going to be important in a narrative report? Yeah. Will it be important in a deposition or trial testimony? Yeah. Okay. So all we're doing is putting this into perspective. Okay. Now, these are big categories. Okay. When we go into a narrative report, there's more than 12. But we're trying to make it simple and go, pay attention to the big categories first, then it makes everything else easier if you know what's most important. So what's most important? The 7 minimum categories. What's next? The 12 categories of documentation for a narrative report, deposition, or trial testimony. Okay. So here you got their number 7 is response to treatment. We'll include how they responded to treatment. Did they get better, worse, stay the same, or end up with a permanent problem to some degree the rest of their life? We'll go into complicating factors. So is response to treatment and complicating factors, are those unbelievably important factors one of the 7 categories that determines the strength of a case? No. No, not at all. But it's going to be a major category in a narrative report or deposition or trial testimony. So hopefully we're kind of we're trying to go, okay, I can see where these categories would be unbelievably important, the 7. But the 12 major categories is like the base. This is the base. And you do need to know this. You need to know these 12 categories. And then after response to treatment, there's complicating factors. And then you have MMI, maximum medical improvement. Remember, that's based on the science of the 3 phases healing. We'll cover that. And then that takes us to the impairment rating, AMA guides, and the impairment indexes. That takes us to the prognosis and need for future care. And then we apportion if there's a pre-existing injury. These 12 categories are the core of a narrative report, deposition, or trial testimony. Now, there are more than 12. There's a lot of categories, subcategories in all of these in a trial testimony. There's 114 questions in a trial testimony that we want our attorney to ask, 114. There's about 30 categories in the narrative report, but this is the core. These are the 12, In other words, if you were going to tell the story to anybody, even a stranger on the street, these would be the 12 you would bring up. Now, if you wanted to go to the core of the case, go, well, what's the strength of the case? Well, some of these don't matter as much. So I'm going to pay attention to these 7. These are the 7 that are the most important categories of documentation that will determine the strength of the case. Now, the strength of the case we'll go into, but remember, how much primary evidence do you have? How much secondary evidence do you have? How many different categories? So as an example, if I look at the objective evidence, let's say I had all of these, I had at least one evidence in each category. And let's go to the objective. And let's say I have 1, x-rays. X-rays show a permanent problem, okay? Let's say I had more than 1. I had 2 primary objective. Now remember, objective is the most important evidence category because it can't be contested. Let's say I had more than 1 primary evidence. I had 2. And let's say they were in different categories. I not only had an x-ray category, but I had another diagnostic category. That case just got stronger. Let's say I have 3 primary pieces of evidence that are objective. That case just got significantly stronger. And let's say that all 3 of those categories are in different anatomical categories. One might be x-ray, and then one might be a different diagnostic category, and then another one might be in a different diagnostic category. See, now you have 3 totally different diagnostic categories of primary evidence. Can you see how that's way stronger than if you just had 1? And it'd be really bad if you had 0 for the injury award. It's good for the patient, bad for the injury award. Now, why am I putting so much importance on this? This is the single greatest concept to get across to the attorney when we do our marketing. It is not about one test. It's not about that you had a positive this or a positive that. No case is ever won or lost on one biomarker, and you never make a diagnosis based on one biomarker, ever. You want to set yourself up for failure? Base it on one biomarker, one test. What is most important relative to you creating credibility, authority, and attorney referrals is the attorney knows you know how to put the whole case together. You know what's most important, least important, and you know how to put it together. Even if it's a bad case, a bad injury award. I cannot emphasize what I just said. And the reason I say that is so many doctors will start learning personal injury, and they'll take this one test and they'll run to their attorney. Attorney, this one test gives a 25% impairment rating. Look at me. No, that is not how it works. And that is not what you do. I would rather show the attorney that I know these categories and the patient not have any of them than run to them with one objective positive finding. That doesn't show you know jack. Doesn't show you know anything. And any other Tom, Dick, or Harry chiropractor can do the same thing. What they can't do is explain the strength of the case and why it's strong or weak. So when I get all my information from the one of the things we will do, and you will do, and the attorney will ask you when you actually know how to create referrals, the attorney will ask you how strong the case is. But before that happens, you need to be telling them how strong of a case this is or is not. And that's where the value is of credibility and authority. Even if the case is worthless, and you put it together and go, this is why the case is worthless. and you put it, and you showed them all this, you showed them the 7 categories, and they didn't have any of it. Now he knows you know what you're doing, even though there was 0 for an injury award. That's what's most important, not an injury award. And I push the concept because so many chiropractors have a hard time. They get a referral and they think, oh man, I hope this case brings in a lot of money. Absolutely wrong mentality. You don't care what it brings in. You at least want it to bring a 3-to-1. I mean, if there's not much to the case, there better not be a big bill. You know, they should still get a 3-to-1 injury award with a bad case, because your documentation shouldn't always be $7,000. Okay. All right. So this is why this is so important. Now, that takes us to the last piece of this big puzzle, the 4 potential injury awards. There are 4 potential injury awards from the doctor's documentation. 4, not 1. Many times attorneys may not know this. Most doctors don't know this. So now the attorney can get other awards. They'll get money for, the car, time, other things, but that's not related to the doctor's documentation. And by the way, the doctor's documentation will represent 97% of the injury award. That's how important the doctor's documentation is. So these are the 4 potential injury awards based on the doctor's documentation. So you do need to know this. Okay. This is the end game right here. Okay. Number 1 is the medical injury award. Take all the medicals, add them together, multiply it times 3. That's the medical. And by the way, we have formulas for these. I'll share with you later the formulas, how to convert the doctor's documentation into each of these 4 injury awards, because that's the next question they're going to ask you. The one question you go, well, how strong is the case? And then they'll go, how much do you think it's worth? Well, you need to know that. We're going to cover that. Okay. These are the 4 potential injury awards that your documentation can bring. And you're the one that needs to know how to do it and convert it. You're the one that's going to be telling the attorney what the potential injury award is, because they don't know the documentation. They're not doctors. They just know big picture stuff, and that's it. You're the one that has to put it all together, and you're the one that has to tell them, you got a strong case. This is why you have a strong case. You've got a weak case. This is why you have a weak case. See, you're the one that has to be able to do that. And then you're the one that says, look, this is a high potential injury award. Let me share with you why. And then you're the one that explains the formula that converts your documentation into these 4 injury awards. See, that's where the value is. That's where authority and credibility is. So there's the medical injury award. There's the impairment injury award. There's pain and suffering injury award. And there's the prognosis and need for future care injury. And if you remember, I shared with you earlier, if you did not go to MMI, we showed you how important MMI was, maximum medical improvement, based on the science of the 3 phases of healing. So if you did not go to MMI, or the patient didn't reach MMI, or they didn't have MMI, then you've just eliminated 2 of the 4 injury awards. You have, see, because you have to have a permanent impairment for the impairment injury award. You have to have a permanent impairment for the prognosis and need for future care injury award. So if that patient did not get MMI, or they reached it and there's no permanent impairment, that's a weak case. You need to be able to explain to the attorney that. And it's easy to do when you know those 7 categories that I just referred to that determine the strength or weakness of a case. Or just the opposite. And by the way, it's one of the ways also to get the attorneys from taking the patients from under your care. They don't realize it. They're actually hurting their injury award when they say, hey, let's wrap this up. I want to submit it. Some attorneys will do that. And the patient has not even gone through the 3 phases of healing and reached MMI. The attorney doesn't know he's hurting the injury award by doing that. Well, when he does that, and if the doctor doesn't know any better, and so he wraps the case up, the doctor just eliminated 2 of the 4 potential injury awards. The patient didn't reach MMI. That means they can't get an impairment rating. That means there's going to be no impairment injury award. It means there's going to be no prognosis and need for future care injury award. And the attorney doesn't even know it. He just shot himself in the foot. And 95% of the chiropractors don't know it. They will wrap the case up because they don't want to piss off the attorney. And little do they know, they just significantly hurt the case. Well, when you explain it to the attorney, go, hey, Mr. Attorney, you might want to let these things go to MMI, and this is why. Because when you don't, you're gutting your injury award. You're eliminating 2 of the 4 potential injury awards.
I think letting go is like a